right, guys, I am joined by Lee Hunt. He is the founder of Lee Hunt LLC, a New York-based consultancy focusing on brand strategy, media architecture, competitive analysis, and personal training for television networks and media companies. Lee, thanks so much for the time. I appreciate it.
Good to be here.
There's so much you do.
Yeah, it keeps me pretty busy.
I would like to dig into your history a little bit, because I know you've worked in the industry as a whole, and you've started companies, you've sold companies, you now have Lee Hunt LLC. So talk me through a little bit about your background.
Yeah, well, I started out, I'm from Texas originally, so I started out working for a public television station in Dallas, which is my hometown.
A Cowboy fan, or?
Yeah, it runs in the family.
Yeah,
I like 5 generations of Texans, so it goes all the way back. But so worked there for a while, and then decided I wanted to get out into the rest of the world. So moved up to New York, and that was in the early 80s, really the beginning of the cable revolution.
Yeah.
And went to work for a company called Satellite News Channel. And they were really CNN's first competitor. It was a compendium of ABC News and Group W. But it was such an early days of cable that there really wasn't enough distribution, wasn't enough audience, so they couldn't support it. So eventually Turner bought it out and shut it down.
Interesting.
And it became what we now know as headline news. It took that channel space.
Wow.
So from Satellite News Channel, I went over to Lifetime Television. And Lifetime back then was positioned as talk television because it just had all these different talk shows. It had been a combination of the Cable Health Network and owned by Hearst. So it was interesting, while I was working there in on-air promotion, and it was talk television because we had like Dr. Ruth and Richard Belzer and Regis Philbin all doing talk shows all day. And the president of the network, who came from the ad sales side, at one point realized, you know what, about 70% of our audience is female. And he said, what if we just made this a network just for women? Now that sounds like a very logical idea now, but back then that was a really radical concept, because why would you disenfranchise 51% of your potential audience?
Right.
But obviously it was the right choice, and that was actually the first time I got to do a channel brand reposition. So we went from being talk television to television for women. And that became very successful, and the channel succeeded. From there, I went over to MTV Networks to do a repositioning of VH1. And VH1
a lot of different demographics were hopping over this time.
And it was because it was an exploding time in the cable industry, and everything was changing, and everything was being very niche oriented, and everybody was trying to find their place. And VH1 was interesting because it had been created to block another Turner music video channel. That Ted had decided he could do what MTV did, because MTV didn't own the content. It came from the record companies. He said, I can do the same thing. So to block the Turner version of MTV, Viacom, well, it wasn't Viacom back then, but MTV Networks created VH1. So I went in to do one of the repositionings, and VH1 has been repositioned so many times. That's always one of the problems of being a step brand, is that you never really have your place. You're always sort of the second tier to the mothership. So after VH1, I went down to Atlanta and launched TNT, and that really became Turner's flagship. And it was interesting because
I love everybody over at Turner. Good people.
Yeah, they're really great, and it was a wonderful place to work because you're in Atlanta, and so it's not exactly the media capital, but
it feels like a very family-oriented culture too. I don't know if it was back then, but so far
it was in a lot of senses, and because you had CNN, it was actually 2 campuses back then. There was Techwood and there was CNN Center. So CNN was over there, and it was really just TBS and TNT and a little bit of Turner Sports at that time. But it was interesting because Ted already had TBS, and it was very successful. It was really the first general entertainment cable network out there, because he's the first one to take a local station, put it up on the satellite, send out the signal all across the U.S. So he said, well, I want to start this second general entertainment channel, TNT. And so it was a group of us from New York and L.A. that came down to launch it. And we said, well, what do you want this channel to be? And he said, well, you know, I created CNN, and it's very successful, but honestly, CNN is about bad news. And I want something that's positive. And so he talked about sort of this idea, the power of positive programming. At the same time, he had the Goodwill Games, which was very much like the Olympics, that he had created. Teams from different nationalities would all come together, like the Olympics, every 4 years and compete for goodwill. And he said, well, I want that to be on the channel. We're like, okay, that's 2 weeks every 4 years. Not exactly going to fill the primetime schedule. But he had also bought the MGM movie library. So we were able to take a lot of that content. He didn't want to make a movie channel. But we took a lot of that different content and put it all together. And it was funny, in 2 meetings, in one of them he said, you know, maybe we should create a movie channel. There was already American Movie Classics, but so eventually he created Turner Classic Movies. But the funny one is we're sitting in a meeting with him one day, and we've got all these MGM cartoons. And he said, you know, we should make a cartoon network. And we thought that was the craziest idea ever. It's like, who's going to watch cartoons 24 hours a day? And again, now it seems like such an obvious idea, but back then it was so radical. And that was the thing about Ted. He was very good at seeing past the horizon.
Well, and I went to Atlanta this is last year, but there's a hallway where it's like Ted Turner's timeline of like that first satellite to all those. I mean, it's so inspiring to just walk down the hallway. Jeez, what an innovator,
an amazing man. And it was interesting, though, when we were launching TNT, it was sort of a tough time for him because he'd done the MGM deal and pretty much had to hawk a lot of the company. And a lot of people said, you know, he lost his chops. He made a really bad deal, and he was going through a lot of depression. He admitted that he was taking lithium.
Wow.
He was coming up on the anniversary of his father's suicide. He was coming to the same age. He was dating Jane Fonda. There was a lot of things going on then. But he was a really amazing person to work with.
That's incredible, man. What a cool story.
Yeah.
So tell me about Leigh Hunt LLC and the type of clients you focus on.
Yeah, well, what happened, I had a creative services company all through the 90s. My last job, I worked in program development at MTV and realized I'm not a program person at all.
Right.
So when I left MTV in 1990, I started Creative Services Agency, and that's really when cable was taking off. So it was a good time. We specialized in branding and rebranding and positioning different channels, primarily in the U.S., but also around the world. Had that for, I guess, just about 10 years, and during the height of the tech boom, Razorfish bought us out. Because it was interesting, the two founders, when I asked them, why are you interested in buying us? We're a creative services company for television networks, and you're very focused on the internet. And again, this is 1999, and most of the internet was still text-based or still images. We didn't have a lot of video at that point. And they said, we really believe that the future of the internet is going to be video-based. And we want to have that expertise. They were right, but they were about 5 years a little too early.
Which happens, yeah.
So they bought my company. I worked in their London office for a while, and then when everything sort of fell apart in the internet, I left and I started my consultancy. So I've been doing that for the last, I guess, 17, 18 years. And what I do is pretty much 3 things. I work on brand strategy for a lot of networks, everything from, if you remember, the USA Characters Welcome, wrote that strategy. FX is Fearless.
Wow.
Hallmark's the heart of TV. So trying to find, what these different channels stand for.
That's awesome, man.
So that's a big focus of it. I also do a lot of on-air architecture, helping networks figure out how to put together an hour of television to make it as sticky as possible. And then I also do a lot of training for different networks.
That's awesome. So how have you seen kind of the in-house versus outsource mentality? I know there's kind of like pendulum swings, it seems like.
Yeah, it goes in cycles, is that you'll see a tightening of the belts, and they will say, okay, we're going to jettison a lot of people, but the workload doesn't change.
Exactly.
They said, okay, now we need to go outside. So they start going outside for a while, and they go, this is really expensive. Let's bring it inside. And so, in the 40 years I've been in the business, I've seen that cycle go up and down and up and down.
I think the famous example is Pepsi decides to bring all their, marketing and advertisement internal, and then the Kendall Jenner ad happened where that got a lot of. So it's kind of like sometimes when you don't have that outsourced thought, it can be bad for you. So I will ask you somewhat to repeat yourself. I apologize in advance, but you're kind of known here at ProMax BDA for the new best practices.
Right.
I know you broke that down yesterday, the 2018 best practices. So for me in the audience, it'd be awesome if you kind of just quickly, not the whole thing, but just some of the things.
I won't make
see if
you
your
sit
clicker
through 40
works this
minutes
time.
of it. Yeah.
But no, just maybe the top level things that you're really seeing in this
essentially,
year.
I sort of broke the presentation into 2 parts. The first was a focus on cross-platform messaging, because we're seeing more and more linear channels recognizing they need to compete with all the different options that people have outside of linear television, and whether it's pushing people to their own app, to an OTT service that they have a relationship with, whether it be a Hulu or all the way to a Netflix where they've sold content, or actually sending people to MVPD, video on demand, on your set-top box. So how do you take that linear audience, which is where you're getting the bulk of your money, send them to those platforms efficiently without cannibalizing your linear audience, but also make sure you're able to get them back or to move them to another platform? And the behavior is changing so much and so quickly, no one's quite figured out what the best formula is, and it continues to develop and grow. And there are some networks who are sort of leading that, and others that are following, and some that haven't quite gotten there. So we sort of looked at that and examples of how different networks were trying to do it.
So if you're a network, it seems like you must kind of play in the different sandboxes of YouTube TV and Hulu as far as rights. But then, like to your point, it almost becomes a conflict of interest because you're making your money on linear, that's where your advertising is, but you're sending people to all these different subsets. Is there a right answer there, or right now as we stand, you kind of have to just feel it out?
I don't think there is a right answer yet. We know that most of the networks, their nonlinear dollars are made on video on demand, working with an MVPD, a telco operator, satellite operator, cable operator. But that's not necessarily the best place to put their content because they're competing with every other network and every other show. But if they send people to their app, to their TV Everywhere site, there's no other content on that site except theirs. So they're keeping them in a little bit of a walled garden. So that's really better for the brand, and also to get people to sample other content that they own rather than that their competitor owns. So it's still sort of shaping, what's best for the business and what's best for the brand are not necessarily the same thing. One is more, the brand's a long-term investment, and the business is often a short-term investment, hitting those quarterly numbers.
So if you're running a television network right now, do you think you almost have to take 3 steps back in order to take 7 steps forward in the future in terms of how they're paying the bills now, and maybe in 10 years from now, how they're going to make most of their money?
I don't think it's about taking 3 steps back. It's just sort of recognizing there are certain investments that you have to make that in the long run will pay off. And that's tough to do when you're a publicly traded company.
And the ROI won't be immediate type deal.
Yeah, exactly.
How big of an issue is that? I see with publicly traded companies, they want those core results. They want to appease their shareholders. And I know I read an article recently, I think it was on Adweek, about the head of FX and how he's trying to find a way to think 3 or 5 years out, which really isn't how most people do it, but it really is a smart way to do it.
That John
survive.
And John is probably one of the most brilliant programmers out there, and really understands behavior. He's the one who coined the term peak TV, with this idea that we're coming to the peak of too much choice in television, nearly 500 scripted series that will launch just this year. That doesn't even include the non-scripted. And you think about that.
Netflix, 800 shows alone this year?
It continues to grow. And there's a certain point he's predicted where it'll begin to collapse. So he's trying to plan for that. And now he's got it's interesting, he's sort of part of a system with 2 different suitors. You've got Disney, which is very good at keeping their brands intact, whether it be Marvel or the Star Wars
And does FX
brand.
even fit under that brand just because it's not as family friendly, a little more edgy,
I think that what we've seen with Disney is they've been pretty good at letting brands do what they
their
do
thing, which
best.
That's smart,
And then you've got Comcast, which has actually been very good with NBCU and very supportive. I mean, obviously they're a technology company first, but they recognize the importance of NBC and all the Universal entities being content creators. So they got 2 different suitors there with different strings. So it'll be interesting to see which one ends up with Fox and how FX and John fits into that equation.
I would love to hear your thoughts on these, these conglomerates kind of merging, obviously, with the data plus the original content, AT&T and Time Warner. Do you think that's the smartest way to go up against the Netflixes and the OTTs?
I think they've all realized that you've got to have that kind of strength. And what I really believe is that the future is going to be vertical portfolios. If you think about it, they're really, well, as I pointed out yesterday, that 82% of the top 50 networks are controlled by, last year, what was 8 media companies, and what in the next couple of months probably 6 media companies. So if you think, okay, if each one of those media companies created a vertical portfolio, a channel essentially, and they've got all their sub-channels underneath it, is that, as a consumer, all right, I'm going to buy the NBC Fox or the Disney Fox grouping, the Discovery Scripps grouping, the CBS Viacom grouping, Netflix, Amazon. Since Hulu is really sort of a combination of those, that'd probably fall out.
Right.
And I think, okay, I'd pay for 6 super channels as part of my skinny bundle, and I'd still get probably 80 or 90% of the content I get in a 500 channel universe.
Right. You mentioned that you went through that 80s cable revolution that really changed the industry. I think this is a media revolution that we're sitting in right now. Do you think it's as serious as the 80s? Is it bigger than the 80s when it comes to that transition?
Yeah, it's very different. And really the 80s were all about, and most of the 90s were really about growth. The industry kept growing, advancing, distribution kept growing, viewership kept growing, is that we hadn't reached saturation. We've certainly hit that point now. And so that's why we've got people cord shaving, cord cutting, cord nevers. So it's interesting, Mike Benson, who's the head of marketing for Amazon.
I saw his talk very well.
And he described the industry right now as a slow motion train wreck. And I think that's a pretty good description, because we're not going to. We've hit the top of the ceiling.
Yes.
And so the ceiling's not going to get any higher. The only way we grow is by expanding horizontally, and that means stretching some things out. And unfortunately, it probably means doing it with fewer people, because the ceiling is where the revenue grows. Is you're growing horizontally.
Yeah.
You don't have more revenue, but you have more work to do.
Gotcha.
So it's a different kind of expansion.
Some of the D+ players are going to have to fall off, it sounds like.
Well, they already are.
Yeah,
We're seeing the smaller channels begin to drop off, and unfortunately a lot of people in the industry losing their jobs with that.
Looking at history, like the cable revolution, it really started to take off once Fortune 5s or the brand started to take that seriously and kind of be able to monetize and up those budgets so they had higher quality content. Hasn't really happened just yet on the digital platforms and branded content. It's starting to happen, but do you think that's going to be the major shift once the advertisers say this is what we believe in?
I think so. It was Dawn Ostroff, was speaking of it. She talked about, and I'm not sure I completely agree with this, but I thought it was a pretty good analogy, how the early days of cable, the content was short and not very good quality because there just wasn't the economic force behind it.
There wasn't budget, yeah.
But as it became more popular, it got longer. And became better high quality. And so she compared that to what's going on with digital now. I mean, I think part of it it's a different medium. Cable and broadcast are very close to the same medium. Digital is a very different kind of experience in my mind. So, and it is true that things that have been very short in digital are getting longer, but I don't think it'll replicate what happened in television. But I do think we will see the quality go up over time as there's more demand, and whether it's on a subscription model, advertising model, or some new model no one's figured out yet, it will get better.
Well, we saw that Recode came out with an article in 2017 was the first time digital advertising outspent linear advertising, which is a huge shift, and that's only going to continue to grow. Have you seen, just working with your different clients, just more emphasis on, I guess, digital inventory and rate cards and being able to have more of their partners ingrained with their digital side of things rather than just the linear part?
Yeah, I think so. Is that you look at particularly NBCU and how they've done their advertising as an entire portfolio rather than individual silos. So recognizing that there are different ways to vertically integrate all this different content on all these different platforms. And very smart people figuring this out.
Right.
And we're talking about a $75 billion a year industry.
Yes,
so
it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
So what do you think the biggest thing brands must focus on as we sit here in 2018? If you're giving your best consultant advice, you're like, guys, you have to make sure that you tackle this.
Yeah, it's
this
one word.
thing.
It's relevancy. Is that, understanding who your target audience is, make sure that they are available and it's an audience you want, and making sure your content or whatever service you're providing is relevant to them.
Does it go down just the convenience, like focusing on the consumer, their convenience, their time? Does that?
Yeah, certainly. You want to make the experience as easy as possible.
Consume,
and one of the things I always talk about in television, inertia is our best friend. Is that we get somebody watching television, we don't want them to get up and leave. A commercial wants you to get up and go out and buy something.
Yes.
We want you to sit there and just stay watching. So whatever platform it happens to be, and all that comes from the convenience of, I don't have to stop and think about it. If you think about, for example, Comcast X1 box, is that now you don't have to search through the IPG. You just say, show me Seinfeld.
Yeah.
And it'll take you through the entire list of all the Seinfeld
Yeah.
episodes. So that kind of convenience enabled to, because that's the other problem. There's so much content out there. Is how do we filter it? And even when we do filter it, how do we get to it easily without having to navigate through different screens, different devices, different platforms?
Obviously, you can read a lot of books. You can talk to other people. You can bring consultants, but I want to get your thoughts on it. Is there a tool as far as analysis or helping you kind of make those decisions that you've seen in the industry that is helpful for folks that are making these decisions?
The tools are continually changing. I mean,
Yeah.
I have a separate service called CMO Intelligence, and we track the on-air marketing of 24 general entertainment networks, plus Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon. And our clients find that really interesting to be able to see more on a creative level, who's doing what, how much they seem to be spending on it, certainly as far as time, and also you get a sense of production dollars. But the tools are going to continually grow and change.
Technology's moving too quickly to kind of keep up with it.
It is. I mean,
Yeah.
I was actually, TiVo introduced a new service, maybe it's not even a service, called TAD, where they can actually, with their second-by-second ratings, look at an individual piece of creative and tell you what the conversion rate, how many people who saw that spot tuned into the show.
Yeah.
And they can do that across a campaign. They can even do one of the things that I always consider the holy grail is that we know by ratings, and particularly second-by-second ratings, when you see a drop, okay, somebody left. But where did they go? Most of the time we have no idea.
Yes.
They're actually able to track the migration that, okay, they left ABC and they went over to Fox.
Interesting.
And then how long did they stay at Fox? When did they come back to ABC? Or did they ever come back? So with those kind of tools, as we get more granular, it'll become much more complicated, but we'll be able to know much more.
Do you think Nielsen total ratings will solve that, or is that still something?
I know Nielsen's trying to solve it. There are a lot of other third-party companies. Yeah. It's hard to know who's actually going to figure it out, but it hasn't been figured out yet.
So if we sit here again in 12 months, hopefully, what do you think the biggest thing that we'll see change over the next 12 months when it comes to the media industry as a whole?
Well, I think that after this last Monday with the AT&T Time Warner has sort of given the green light for everybody else to look at mergers. So I think you'll see a lot of movement there. Some will be successful, some it won't. But I think that sense of consolidation will continue forward, certainly in the next 12 months.
And then if you're a president of a television network today, what's the main thing you're focusing on over the next 3 to 6 months that you think you have to figure out to make sure that you stay relevant? You keep on
I think over
the
next 3 to 6 months is, first of all, the normal development cycle of any show is 18 months to 2 years. So you're thinking about what product you have now and how to make it as successful as possible.
In 2020.
And is it going to continue forward? So it's hard to have that kind of short-term vision. You got to really be thinking farther out. And that's, I give programmers so much credit to try to anticipate what people are going to like 3 years from now.
Yeah, it's tough.
I don't know how they do it.
Well, Lee Hunt, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for stopping by, and we've learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.